Hi, I'm Teresa, and this is my presentation, which explores the concept of consciousness, free will, and reality. We're going to look at what the scientific research says about these subjects and also what I think. I'm going to be using two famous studies and multiple interpretations of these studies. The first one is the Libet experiment, and then we're going to look at the double slit experiment. Both of these experiments are trying to understand how our brains interact with the environment. In the Libet experiment, they are trying to figure out where the signals to move come from in our brains. In the double slit experiment, they are investigating the phenomenon in quantum wave function tests, which appear to be affected by consciousness. Now, I think you're probably wondering, how do these two studies relate to each other? Well, in the first study, they're looking at how our brains create the action to interact with our environment. And the second study, the double slit study, they're looking at how consciousness affects our reality and how even at the quantum level, matter falls into a form when it is being observed. So truly, is there a subjective reality? So we're going to talk about the Libet experiment. In the Libet experiment, an EEG was used to measure the brain activity, specifically focusing on readiness potential, which is a slow buildup of electrical activity in the brain that occurs before a voluntary movement. The readiness potential, RP, begins approximately 350 milliseconds before the subject becomes consciously aware of their intention to act, indicating that the initiation of voluntary actions is unconscious. Unconscious brain processes initiate voluntary actions before conscious intention appears. So what this means is voluntary acts can be initiated by unconscious cerebral processes before conscious intention appears. So basically, before we know we want to move, there is a buildup of electrical potential in our brains, in our neurons. However, conscious control over motor actions still remain possible. So Libet's experiment suggests that unconscious brain processes initiate voluntary actions before our conscious intention appears, before we realize that this is happening. Consciousness does not initiate the action, but can intervene by allowing the action to proceed or vetoing it during the final 100 to 200 milliseconds before the act. However, the ability to veto actions provides a mechanism for conscious control and responsibility, allowing for a form of free will, termed free will. So really, did Libet ever say that we don't have free will? Because a veto mechanism, this free won't, is really what people are kind of talking about when they talk about free will. It's the ability to stop yourself from doing things and the ability to do things spontaneously. So despite criticisms, we are still looking into where this RP comes from. The Beck's experiments are often generalized to all conscious actions of people, which may not be appropriate. The experiment assumes that RP reflects unconscious intention to act, but this interpretation has been challenged. So recent challenges reflect that RP may come from stochastic fluctuations in neural activity rather than from movement preparation. And also, the timing of conscious intention is not a reliable measurement, and newer methods such as tone probes indicate that intention may occur earlier than previously thought. So they were relying on people to be looking at a clock and then to say that is the time they stopped the clock and that is the time that they thought to move. But that is not necessarily a great timing mechanism to know when people don't want to move or want to move. Sorry, I'm just looking through some of my notes here. So also the performance of test subjects in lab experiments were not spontaneous. The subjects were aware that they were part of the experiment and were instructed on when to make decisions which could influence behavior. Also, the experiment just assumes that RP is related to the movement that comes after it, which may not always be the case. It has been demonstrated that robust RPs can occur even in the absence of movement, suggesting that RP is not a sufficient enactment of motor action. The complexity of brain process and the variability in experimental conditions make it difficult to draw conclusions about the nature of free will. And also, I do not think that Libet ever mentioned anything about not having free will. So Libet's experiments and implications for the debate on free will versus determinism will continue in the psychological debates. Cognitive consciousness influences our perceptions of reality. And theoretical models and empirical evidence suggest that consciousness plays a significant role in shaping our experiences of reality, particularly within the framework of quantum mechanics. So phenomenal consciousness is a subjective experience of being aware. And cognitive accessibility involves the ability to access the processes of information which is intertwined with phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experience of being aware, suggesting that observing and consciousness play a role in collapsing the wave function, and that cognitive accessibility is crucial for the mind's construction of reality. Measurement problem is the curious effect whereby quantum objects appear to behave differently when observed than when unobserved. The QPM is a problem because it violates the common sense doctrine of realism, which assumes that the world at large is independent of observation. However, empirical evidence supports that consciousness plays a foundational role in shaping perceived reality. The principle of veiled non-locality suggests that consciousness disguises its wholeness and non-locality to produce local processes, making non-local quantum effects appear classical and local to our senses. So, an autonomy is defined as self-governed through regulation by the self. It is essential for full functioning, mental health, and optimal performance across various domains and cultures. Empirical evidence supports the universal importance of autonomy for well-being and functioning. So, consciousness is crucial to our conceptions of free will and morality, So if our consciousness can affect reality and our well-being is dependent on our autonomy, it stands to reason that our brains would create the feeling of free will or autonomy. Make up reality as we go. It is all an illusion that we agree on. And as a social species, we need each other so that the illusion of reality in our minds approximates the real. So, because our brains and reality function together to create the world as we know it, we can also, our brains have an effect on the world as we see it. And so how does this go back to the Libet experiment about where movement or free will comes from? Well, I just think that it's hard to make any kind of conclusions based on the electrical impulses in our brain, considering that we can change reality. So is that really happening? You know, like we can create the world we want. So if we want that readiness potential to prove to us that free will is not real, then that is what it will do. Can we ever know what is objectively real? Perhaps not. But we can find common ground on what we subjectively know, with the caveat that this is the best understanding we have at the moment. Thank you for listening to me. So what I think is that this means that we need to live in community and we need to work with each other to build the reality that we want. Because my reality will affect your reality and your reality affects my reality. So as an entire group, we need to create a reality that we want. That's the end of the presentation. So thank you for watching. I appreciate everybody